Next, I am delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend, Mary Catherine Lader, head of Aladdin Sustainability at BlackRock, responsible for driving sustainable data, analytics, and technology to the firm and to our clients. MC, welcome to the Future Forum.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's good to see you. Listen, earlier today we heard Larry discuss climate risk as investment risk. Tell us how investors are assessing climate risk today and incorporating their views into the investment portfolio.
Well, the truth fact is that a lot of investors aren't doing it, and there aren't really good ways to do it. And we learned this the hard way in early 2020 as we made a commitment as a firm to integrate climate risk as an investment risk and did a thorough assessment of what was out there to do that broadly across an entire enterprise of 1,000 plus investors. And we found that really there weren't tools that helped investors take the best of climate science, the best analysis of climate policy implications, and incorporate that in a useful way in their portfolios. And so that's part of why we've actually endeavored to help fill that gap. But I think really critically, there really aren't good tools out there today, and it's a really serious challenge.
Okay, now I know intuitively that data and analytics should be at the center of sustainable investing. But of course, while we have a lot of historical data, looking forward, we don't really know exactly how the climate is going to change or which policies will be enacted to drive decarbonization. How is BlackRock going to help investors make those informed decisions?
Right. So I mentioned that there aren't great tools today, and I think the expectations from investors of building a so-called net zero portfolio or from regulators about doing climate stress testing really are ahead of reality. So while we can't predict the weather for the next several decades, of course, and we can't predict policy, we can at least build models and tools, software that will help investors run different scenarios and understand the potential impact in their portfolio. So we're building a tool called Aladdin Climate. That's a software product that allows you to understand what's the impact of climate change on my portfolio. So rising sea levels, rising temperatures, how might that actually change your mortgage-backed security portfolio, for example, and introduce risk? And then also to answer the question of what's the impact of my investments on the world, on the potential changes in the climate. So understand transition risk. We are not pretending to become the world's leading climate scientists, but we are partnering with a number of experts and leading firms to do that. So in the case of physical risk, we work with a group called the Rhodium Group that takes global climate models and downscales them to a really small geographic unit to project the potential change in flood risk and hurricane risk at 3 meter by 3 meter units. And then they actually lead the largest academic collaboration on the economic impact of those changes. So they then hand over to us some damage functions, we call them, that project potential changes in GDP, in employment, in home prices as a result of changes in the climate. And we incorporate that in our risk models. And ultimately, we're delivering through Aladdin Climate, climate adjusted analytics, climate adjusted prices, climate adjusted duration, probability of default. So if we want investors to incorporate climate risk as an investment risk, we have to put it in terms that are familiar. It's not realistic to expect dozens or hundreds of people whose behavior change is needed to meet a commitment like a net zero commitment, for example. It's not realistic to expect them to all become experts in climate risk. And so that's why we're developing Aladdin Climate to really translate that science and policy into the familiar lexicon of financial analytics.
Now, I know it's still early days, but can you give us an example of how BlackRock's working with a client to build a portfolio with an eye specifically toward climate risk?
Sure. So clients are really asking two questions. The first question is, what should my climate objective be? We haven't really aligned on what exactly a climate objective is. It's not realistic to have a net zero portfolio, but what kind of pathway or alignment can you have in a portfolio? And the second question is, what impact might that have? So one example is we were working with a large insurer who was trying to assess how they might have a more climate aware portfolio. And they were concerned that if they did that, it might have an impact on their ability to meet their obligations over time. So we spent a lot of time with them, helping them think through what metric, what indicators actually do make a more climate aware portfolio. They, for example, were initially interested in those companies that had made net zero commitments, but present day commitments are certainly not an indication of future behavior. And so we worked with them to think about a number of different data points that you could look at to identify change over time. How is a company more or less prepared for the transition to a lower carbon economy? And so in working with them, we actually then did an analysis of their entire portfolio, screened it according to that low carbon readiness metric. And we're able to show that if they did try to make those changes, try to have a more climate aware portfolio, it would not impact their ability to meet their obligations and actually in some cases might improve the portfolio. So that's just one example. And I'm hopeful we'll have a lot more as we continue to build out Aladdin Climate.
All right, good stuff. MC, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your insights.
My pleasure.